Revelation chapter 8, verses 1 through 12. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. Then I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood. And these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water, because it had been made bitter. The fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. We see three sets of judgment in the book of Revelation. We see seals, which we've already looked at. We see trumpets, and we see bowls. Now, the seventh seal here in verse 1 brings a dramatic pause, a silence in heaven prior to the seven trumpet judgments. You see, in heaven, all this time, there's been a heavenly praise, worship going on 24/7, if you will. And now there's silence, absolute silence. This is significant. And this heavenly chorus of praise will not resume until chapter 11, verse 15. Well, let's look back at the text here. Starting in verse 1, when the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. So the hymn of heaven falls silent. Now, you have a time period mentioned here, half an hour. Sometimes when an hour is mentioned, you're talking about a specific climatic event. Here you have a half an hour mentioned, so it's a broken hour. That means this is an interruption, a delay in the movement towards that climatic event. The Old Testament often associates silence with divine judgment, and such is the case here. And when this last seal is opened, the drama intensifies as heaven waits in awe. They wait in silence in anticipation for God's intervention. What is God going to do? Look at verse 2. And I saw the seven angels who stand before God, and seven trumpets were given to them. John now sees the seven angels standing in God's presence. Now, Jewish tradition gives names to these angels. These are archangels who stand before God: Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Serachiel, Gabriel, and Ramiel. Now, these angels were given seven trumpets. This is a divine passive. That means that God is the source. God is the one giving these trumpets to these angels. And these trumpets are like heralds. They're going to herald, they're announcing the coming judgment of God. All right, verses 3 through 5 say, and another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. So this is another angel. This angel is distinct from these seven. And certainly these are not identified. The names I mentioned earlier, that's just Jewish tradition. And this angel is not identified either. But one thing we know, it's certainly not Christ. This angel approaches God's presence. And the angel then receives what this text says, much incense. The prayers of all God's people, not just the martyrs, but all of God's people. All the prayers added up are now coming up before God. And he also takes this censer. Now, what is a censer? A censer is a fire pan. You can think of it like that. Holds the coals that burns the incense. And this scene portrays the coals of prayer being sprinkled on the incense, or sprinkled with incense, and then that's all rising up to God as a pleasing aroma, a fragrant aroma. God most certainly hears the prayers, the cries of his people. And what are they crying out for? They're crying out for justice. They're crying out for deliverance. God's answer comes when the angel fills the fire pan with coals from the altar, and then this angel hurls it down to the earth. So God is responding to the prayers of his people, but how does he respond? He responds with judgment, fires from heaven. And these fires from heaven are accompanied by the shaking of the very foundations of the earth itself. So you have the presence of the earthquake here. Literally, this is the breaking of creation. This signals the end and God's coming in judgment. Verses 6 and 7. Now the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. So the first 5 trumpet judgments are patterned after the plagues inflicted on Egypt in the plagues when God was going to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. The first trumpet recalls the 7th plague in Egypt. In this first trumpet, God is sending lightning, thunder, and a huge hailstorm that devastates the land. And then you have fire and blood put into the mix here too. All these things are often associated with judgment. This is what it's representing. As a result, 1/3 of the earth and 1/3 of the trees and all the green grass, it says, are burned up. This is a natural disaster of epic proportions, but it's not natural. This is supernatural. The figure of 1/3 occurs repeatedly throughout this series, which also lets us know that God's judgment at this point is still limited in its scope. Even though it's very severe, he's still holding back. He's not releasing his full wrath here. The intensity has increased from the 1/4, the 1/4 of the seal judgments, but it has not increased to the full level of the bowl judgments that are to come. Verses 8 and 9, the second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea. And 1/3 of the sea became blood. 1/3 of the living creatures in the sea died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. So this judgment alludes to the first Egyptian plague, in which God turns the Nile River into blood. The mention here of a fiery mountain might have reminded John's audience of another fiery mountain experience that they all would have been aware of, and many of them would have remembered in their lifetime, and that was the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Pompeii in AD 79, which destroyed the Roman cities of Pompeii and destroyed Herculaneum. It also could have reminded him of Jeremiah 51, where Babylon is described as a burning mountain, referring to the judgment of that wicked kingdom. So this judgment results in the destruction of 1/3 of the sea life, and it also says the shipping, 1/3 of the shipping. Now that would have severe ramifications for the people living on the earth. In verses 10 and 11, the third angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water because it had been made bitter. Now, this judgment consists of a burning, blazing star falling from the sky into the fresh water supply. Now, this star has a name given to it, and it's named after the effect that it has on the water. Now, they had a shrub that they called the wormwood shrub. It produced a bitter, dark green oil that was used to kill intestinal worms. And it was very, very bitter. It could make you sick. Consequently, wormwood came to symbolize bitterness and sorrow, pain, suffering. So a portion of the water supply is poisoned, killing many of the people. Verse 12, the fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. So this fourth trumpet here draws on the ninth Egyptian plague, which brought dense darkness over the land. And throughout the scriptures, darkness serves as a symbol of divine judgment. You see the same thing happening in Amos and Joel and Matthew and Mark and John and 2 Corinthians. All this mentions darkness in association with God's judgment. Here, God partially reverses creation as he judges the world, leaving it in total darkness for 1/3 of each day and night. So some things to remember. Number one, God is the Lord over all of creation and over all of human history. He is in total control. Nothing's going to surprise him. Nothing's going to take him off guard. And nothing, certainly, is going to overpower him. The second thing we need to remember is that God will reign victorious over every competing god and over every competing idol in the minds of the people. There's no competition. The competition never even comes close. God is God, and there is no other. Third, God responds to the cries of his people. God hears and listens and responds to our prayers. So never lose hope. Never give up praying. God hears, and God will act. And finally, these judgments serve as a prelude to what's coming next, God's deliverance of his people. So think about this. When Jesus came to earth, he lived this life, and then he was sacrificed on the cross. And he came out of that grave. He came back alive. He lit the fuse of history. And that fuse has been burning closer and closer to that stick of dynamite blowing up. Jesus promised that he will come again to judge the living and those who have gone before. And each passing moment right now, tick, 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 brings us ever so much closer to that day, to that moment when it all comes crashing down. And it matters if you follow Jesus or not. It matters for all of eternity. I pray that you have accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, that you have a relationship with him, that your sins are forgiven. If not, then why don't you seek him out? Find somebody you can trust that will tell you the truth about Jesus, and just cry out to God, asking for forgiveness and asking him to come into your life and save you through his precious Son, Jesus Christ. God bless you. Until next time.